My mother called me the night before her 60th birthday and said, "Don't come tomorrow. Your stepsister needs to be the only daughter there." She said it like she was asking me to pick up milk from the store while I was holding the gift I'd spent 3 months making for her. A handmade photo album with pictures from every year of her life that I'd collected from relatives across the country. "What do you mean, don't come?" I asked, thinking I'd misheard. "It's your 60th birthday. I've been planning my speech for weeks." My mother sighed like I was being difficult. "Rebecca feels uncomfortable when you're around. She needs this day to bond with me without competition." Rebecca was 32 years old and had been my stepsister for exactly 11 months since my mother married her father. "Competition? Mom, I'm your daughter, your actual daughter. I've been to every single birthday for 34 years. There was silence on the other end. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "That's the problem. You've had 34 years. Rebecca needs a chance to catch up." I drove to her house immediately, even though it was 10 at night. The lights were on and I could see people inside setting up decorations. My Aunt Diane's car was in the driveway. So was my cousin Tom's truck. They were already there preparing for tomorrow. I knocked and my stepfather Howard answered, looking embarrassed. "Maybe you should come back another time." He tried to close the door, but I saw my mom in the living room hanging streamers with Rebecca. "Mom," I called out and she froze. Rebecca whispered something to her and my mother actually nodded. She walked to the door but didn't invite me in. We discussed this. Tomorrow is Rebecca's day to shine. I looked past her at the banner that said, "Happy 65th birthday, Mom," with a picture of my mother and Rebecca. Just the two of them. "Where are the pictures of me?" I asked, noticing the photo displays around the room. Every single one showed my mother with Rebecca or Howard. 34 years of my life erased. "Rebecca made those. Aren't they nice?" My mother smiled like nothing was wrong. She worked so hard on them. My Aunt Diane came to the door then. "What's going on? Why is Nicole outside?" She looked confused. My mother straightened up. "Nicole isn't coming tomorrow. We discussed it and she agreed it's best." I had agreed to nothing. Diane looked between us. "Are you insane? She's your daughter." Rebecca appeared then holding a cake decorator. "She's triggering for me. Her presence reminds me of my childhood trauma." Everyone stopped. "What trauma?" I asked. "We didn't even know each other until last year." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears on command. "You look exactly like my childhood bully. It's not your fault, but I can't heal with you around." This was the first time I'd heard about any of this. My mother put her arm around Rebecca. "You see? She needs support. Real family support." Diane laughed, but it wasn't funny. "Louise, you've lost your mind. Nicole is your real family." My mother's face changed. "Howard and Rebecca are my family now. My chosen family. Some bonds are stronger than blood." That's when Tom came out from the kitchen. "Aunt Louise, the restaurant needs a final count for tomorrow. How many people?" My mother looked directly at me. 42. Everyone except Nicole." Tom looked shocked. "You're uninviting your own daughter?" Howard stepped forward then. "It's what's best for everyone. Nicole understands." But I didn't understand anything. "Mom, what's really going on? Did Rebecca say something to you? Did she threaten something?" Rebecca started crying harder. "See? She's attacking me again. This is exactly what I mean." She ran inside and my mother followed her immediately. Howard stood in the doorway. "You should go. You're upsetting them." Diane grabbed my arm. "Come to my car, now." We sat in her driveway and she pulled out her phone. "Your mother changed her will last week. Rebecca is now getting everything. The house, the savings, even your grandmother's jewelry." My grandmother had left specific pieces to me when she died. My mother had been holding them until I got married. "How do you know this?" I asked. "Because she asked me to witness it." I refused and told her she was making a mistake. That's when she said Rebecca had been diagnosed with something terminal. My blood went cold. "Terminal? What does she have?" Diane shrugged. She wouldn't say. Just that Rebecca needed to experience a mother's love before she died. That you'd had decades, but Rebecca only had months, maybe weeks. I felt sick. "So she's dying and wants my mom to herself?" Diane shook her head. "I don't think she's dying. I think she's lying, but your mother believes her completely." We drove to my cousin Lisa's house. She was a nurse at the hospital where Rebecca supposedly got treated. Pull her medical records. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. They moved the laptop closer. Lisa's fingers moved across the keyboard, while we sat in her kitchen watching the screen load. The hospital database took forever to pull up Rebecca's file. When it finally appeared, Lisa's face changed. She scrolled through page after page of nothing. No cancer treatments, No chemotherapy records, no oncology appointments. The only visits listed were from 2 years ago for a sprained wrist and last March for the flu. Lisa printed everything she could access without breaking privacy laws and handed me a stack of papers showing Rebecca's complete medical history at their hospital. Every page proved she wasn't dying. We drove back to Diane's house after midnight with the evidence sitting on my lap like it weighed 100 pounds. Tom was still there waiting for us, and when we showed him the printouts, he got so angry he punched the wall. Diane made coffee none of us drank while we sat at her kitchen table trying to figure out what to do next. Tom suggested hiring someone to dig into Rebecca's past, because if she was lying about being terminal, she was probably lying about other things too. Diane knew a private investigator from her work at the courthouse named Dylan Paget who handled fraud cases. She called him right then, even though it was almost 1 a.m, and he answered on the 3rd ring. Diane explained the situation while Tom and I listened to her half of the conversation. Dylan agreed to meet us the next day and said he'd start looking into Rebecca's background immediately. None of us could sleep, so we stayed up making lists of everything suspicious about Rebecca and her story. The terminal illness that changed depending on who she talked to. The way she isolated my mother from anyone who questioned her. How quickly everything happened after my mother married Howard. By the time the sun came up, we had 3 pages of red flags that should have been obvious from the start. Diane called Abigail Lockwood at 9 a.m. Abigail was a family lawyer who handled elder manipulation cases and had helped Diane's friend last year when her father changed his will under suspicious circumstances. Abigail agreed to review everything we'd gathered and meet with us that afternoon. We showed up at her office with the hospital records, the timeline of events, and our list of concerns about Rebecca's behavior. Abigail spent 2 hours going through every document while asking questions about my mother's relationship with Howard and how quickly Rebecca had gained control. She explained that proving undue influence in court was difficult, but not impossible. The speed of the will change helped our case. The fact that my mother had cut me out completely after 34 years helped our case. Rebecca's documented history of lying about her health helped our case. Abigail said we needed more evidence before taking legal action, but what we had so far was enough to start building a case. She told us to document every interaction with my mother and Rebecca from now on. Record phone calls if possible. Save text messages. Keep a detailed timeline of Rebecca's escalating control over my mother's decisions and finances. Abigail warned us that cases like this often got worse before they got better, because manipulators like Rebecca doubled down when they felt threatened. I tried calling my mother 3 times over the next week, but she never answered. I left messages saying I loved her and wanted to talk. I sent texts asking if she was okay. Nothing. On the 8th day, Howard finally picked up when I called. He told me Rebecca had a health crisis after the party, and my mother was too stressed to deal with me right now. I asked what kind of health crisis, and Howard got vague. Something about her heart. Or maybe her lungs. He wasn't sure, but it was serious, and seeing me would make it worse. I asked to speak with my mother directly, but Howard said she was resting. He hung up before I could say anything else. I called Diane immediately and told her about the conversation. She added it to our timeline showing how Rebecca used fake medical emergencies to keep my mother isolated. Dylan called 2 days later with information that made my hands shake. Rebecca's supposed terminal illness changed depending on who she was talking to. He'd interviewed 3 of my mother's neighbors and one of my cousins who'd spoken to Rebecca at the party. She told my mother it was cancer. She told my cousin Sarah it was a rare heart condition. She told the neighbor across the street it was a blood disorder that doctors couldn't treat. Dylan said the inconsistencies were obvious once you started looking for them. A real dying person would have a consistent diagnosis and treatment plan. Rebecca's story shifted to match whatever got her the most sympathy from each person. Dylan was still digging into her background, but already he'd found gaps in her employment history and addresses that didn't match what she'd told Howard. He said he'd have more information in a few days. Lisa contacted Mia Contreras at the hospital. Mia was an administrator Lisa trusted who'd worked there for 15 years. Lisa explained the situation carefully, staying within privacy regulations, while asking Mia to verify whether Rebecca had been treated for any serious conditions. Mia spent 3 days checking records across their hospital network. She found nothing. No cancer treatment at any of their facilities. No heart condition monitoring. No blood disorder diagnosis. Mia provided official documentation that we could use legally showing Rebecca had never been a patient for any of the terminal illnesses she claimed. The documents were stamped and signed and completely legitimate. Mia told Lisa she'd seen cases like this before, where people faked illnesses to manipulate family members. She said the hospital took fraud seriously, and if Rebecca had used fake medical documents to deceive anyone, we should report it. Tom went to my mother's house to check on her because she still wasn't answering my calls. He found her in the backyard pulling weeds while Rebecca sat on the porch drinking lemonade. Tom said my mother looked thin and tired, but she smiled when she saw him. He tried to ask how she was doing, but Rebecca interrupted constantly. Every time Tom mentioned me, Rebecca would say something about her health or her stress levels. My mother seemed completely under Rebecca's spell. She kept talking about making every moment count because Rebecca didn't have much time left. She said Rebecca needed her full attention and support. Howard stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable, but he didn't contradict anything Rebecca said. Tom tried 3 times to ask questions about Rebecca's diagnosis or treatment plan. Each time, both my mother and Howard shut him down immediately. My mother said it was private. Howard said it wasn't his place to share. Rebecca just smiled and changed the subject. Tom left feeling worse than when he arrived. I drove to my mother's house the next morning. I knocked on the door and waited. Rebecca answered wearing one of my mother's robes. She looked at me like I was a stranger trying to sell something. I asked if my mother was home. Rebecca clutched her chest and leaned against the doorframe. She said seeing me caused her too much stress and could trigger a health emergency. She actually gasped for air while saying it. Her hand pressed against her heart in this dramatic way that looked rehearsed. I realized right then that I was watching a performance she'd done many times before. The fake illness, the dramatic symptoms, the convenient timing. Rebecca had practiced this routine until it looked natural. Howard appeared behind Rebecca looking guilty but saying nothing. I asked to speak with my mother directly. Howard stepped forward, blocking the doorway completely. He said my mother was resting and couldn't be disturbed. I tried to push past him, but he held firm. Rebecca watched with this slight smile that made my stomach turn. She wasn't sick. She wasn't dying. She was enjoying this. Howard closed the door in my face while Rebecca's smile got wider. I stood on the porch for 10 minutes hoping my mother would come out. She never did. Diane and I met with Abigail again at her office to discuss legal options. We brought everything we'd gathered over the past 2 weeks. The hospital records, the inconsistent illness stories, Tom's reports about my mother's behavior, the documentation from Mia. Abigail reviewed it all carefully before explaining what we could do. She said we needed more evidence before taking action. Right now, we had enough to raise questions, but not enough to prove undue influence in court. She suggested documenting every interaction from now on, recording dates and times and witnesses, building a timeline that showed Rebecca's escalating control over my mother's decisions and finances. Abigail said cases like this required patience because we needed to prove a pattern of manipulation, not just isolated incidents. She warned us that confronting my mother directly right now would probably backfire because Rebecca had her too convinced. Dylan called that evening with news about Phyllis Hamilton. She was one of Rebecca's former co-workers from 5 years ago at an insurance company downtown. Dylan had tracked her down through employment records and she agreed to meet with us. Phyllis said she'd bring her daughter Danielle, who went to high school with Rebecca, and had stories we needed to hear. We arranged to meet them the next day at a coffee shop near Diane's house. I spent that night unable to sleep thinking about what they might tell us, and whether it would be enough to save my mother from whatever Rebecca was planning. I met Phyllis and Danielle at the coffee shop the next morning. Phyllis was in her 50s with tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too much workplace drama. Danielle sat next to her mother holding a folder stuffed with papers. We ordered drinks and found a quiet corner booth away from other customers. Phyllis pulled out her phone and showed me photos of Rebecca from 5 years ago at their insurance company. She looked younger, but her smile was the same one I'd seen at my mother's house. Phyllis explained that Rebecca joined their team claiming she needed the job to pay for cancer treatments. Everyone felt sorry for her and pitched in money whenever she mentioned medical bills. The company even organized fundraisers and bake sales to help cover her expenses. Over 6 months, Rebecca collected more than $15,000 from coworkers who believed they were saving her life. Then someone's husband who worked at the hospital mentioned he'd never seen Rebecca there for treatments. The company investigated quietly and discovered Rebecca had never been sick at all. She'd made up doctor appointments and treatment schedules while actually spending the money on vacations and shopping. Management gave her a choice between returning the money and leaving quietly or facing criminal charges. Rebecca chose to return most of it and disappeared within a week. Phyllis said she'd felt stupid for believing the lies, but Rebecca had been so convincing with her stories about pain and fear and gratitude. Danielle opened her folder and spread out printed screenshots from old social media accounts. She pointed to photos from high school showing Rebecca surrounded by different groups of students over the years. Danielle explained that Rebecca would target kids who seemed lonely or had problems at home. She'd become their best friend fast and learn all their secrets and vulnerabilities. Then Rebecca would create some crisis that made her the center of attention. Sometimes she claimed abuse from family members. Other times she invented illnesses or said someone was threatening her. She'd turn friends against each other by spreading rumors and lies until everyone was fighting. Then Rebecca would move on to a new group and start over. Danielle showed me a photo of a girl named Sarah who looked vaguely like me. Same hair color and similar features. Sarah had been Rebecca's target junior year until she figured out the manipulation and warned other students. Rebecca told everyone Sarah had bullied her for months and made her life miserable. Most people believed Rebecca because she cried so convincingly. Sarah ended up changing schools to escape the harassment. Danielle said the story about me looking like Rebecca's childhood bully was probably completely made up. Rebecca just needed a reason to push me out, so she could have my mother to herself. I felt sick listening to all this. Rebecca hadn't just stumbled into my mother's life by accident. She'd researched and planned and calculated exactly how to take everything from me. Dylan leaned forward and suggested that Rebecca probably watched my mother and Howard for weeks before Howard even introduced her. She would have learned their routines and habits and emotional weak spots. She'd have figured out that my mother was vulnerable after her divorce and eager to please her new husband. She'd have noticed that Howard felt guilty about something, or wanted to prove himself as a good father. Rebecca had studied them like a predator studies prey before attacking. Phyllis and Danielle gave us copies of everything they had, including contact information for other former coworkers who remembered Rebecca's scam. Kent came by during his lunch break to add his own observations about how Rebecca had manipulated their entire office. He described how she'd play different people against each other while positioning herself as the innocent victim who needed protection. The pattern was always the same. Gain trust through vulnerability. Extract resources through manufactured crisis. Disappear before people fully understood what happened. We left the coffee shop with more evidence than I knew what to do with. Diane drove us back to her house where we organized everything into categories: financial fraud, fake illnesses, emotional manipulation, pattern of behavior across multiple victims. The case against Rebecca was building, but my mother still believed every lie. My Uncle James called that evening saying he'd tried to talk to Howard at the hardware store downtown. James had gone there specifically because he knew Howard shopped there every Saturday morning. He'd approached Howard in the lumber section and asked to speak privately. Howard's face had gone pale and he'd refused to discuss anything about Rebecca or my mother. James said Howard looked trapped and scared rather than defiant or angry. His hands shook when James mentioned Rebecca's name. Howard kept glancing around like he expected someone to be watching. He'd practically run away when James pressed for answers. James thought Rebecca might have some kind of hold over Howard too. Maybe she was threatening him or blackmailing him with something. The fear in Howard's eyes wasn't the look of a man protecting his daughter. It was the look of a man who'd made a terrible mistake and didn't know how to fix it. Diane decided to contact the lawyer who'd witnessed my mother's will change after she refused. She tracked him down through the county records and called his office. The lawyer was reluctant to discuss client matters, but Diane explained the situation carefully. She mentioned the evidence of fraud and the pattern of elder abuse. The lawyer finally admitted that my mother had seemed anxious and rushed during the appointment. She'd kept checking her phone and looking out the window. He'd asked if she was sure about the changes, and she'd said yes, but her voice wavered. The lawyer had noticed a car waiting outside his office the entire time. Someone sitting in the driver's seat watching the building. He'd thought it was odd, but hadn't questioned it. Now he realized it had probably been Rebecca making sure my mother went through with the will change. The lawyer said he'd be willing to provide a statement if we pursued legal action. I spent the weekend going through boxes of old photos and documents I'd stored in my apartment closet. Birthday cards my mother had sent me every year with personal messages. Photos from my high school graduation where she looked so proud. Pictures from family vacations and holidays spanning 3 decades. Letters she'd written when I went to college telling me how much she missed me. I organized everything chronologically, creating a timeline of our relationship. 34 years of evidence that I wasn't the problem Rebecca claimed I was. Every photo showed my mother's genuine love and pride. Every card proved our connection was real and deep. Rebecca was trying to erase all of this and replace it with her manufactured narrative. I made copies of the most important items and put together a presentation that documented our actual history. Tom discovered something disturbing on social media that same weekend. Rebecca had created accounts on multiple platforms where she posted about her journey with her dying mother. The posts were emotional and detailed, describing how she was cherishing every moment with my mother during her final months. She wrote about their deep bond and special connection. She shared photos of them together looking like the perfect mother-daughter pair. The post made no mention of me at all. In Rebecca's version of reality, my mother had only one daughter who loved her and cared for her. The comments were full of sympathy and support from strangers who had no idea they were reading fiction. Rebecca had even started a fundraising page supposedly to help with my mother's medical expenses, though my mother wasn't sick at all. Tom screenshot everything and sent it to Dylan, who added it to our growing file of evidence. Dylan called on Monday with news that made my hands shake. He'd tracked down Rebecca's ex-husband from 10 years ago. The man's name was Noah, and he'd divorced Rebecca after discovering she'd faked a pregnancy and miscarriage to manipulate him. Noah told Dylan that Rebecca had claimed to be pregnant early in their marriage. She'd shown him fake ultrasound photos and talked constantly about their future baby. Noah had been excited and supportive, buying baby furniture and preparing a nursery. Then Rebecca said she'd miscarried and needed time to grieve. She'd used the fake tragedy to control Noah emotionally and extract money for supposed medical bills and therapy. Noah eventually discovered the truth when he found the fake ultrasound photos online. They were stock images Rebecca had downloaded and printed. He'd confronted her, and she'd admitted everything without showing any remorse. She'd actually laughed and said he was stupid for believing her. Noah divorced her immediately and said he'd be willing to provide a detailed statement about her patterns of deception. He wanted to help stop Rebecca from hurting more people the way she'd hurt him. We met with Abigail again on Tuesday, bringing everything we'd collected over the past 2 weeks. The hospital records, the witness statements from Phyllis and Danielle, the information about previous families Rebecca had scammed, Noah's statement about the fake pregnancy, Tom's documentation of the social media posts, the timeline I'd created of my relationship with my mother. Abigail reviewed it all carefully, taking notes and asking questions. She explained that we had a strong case for undue influence regarding the will. The speed of the change combined with Rebecca's documented history of manipulation created a clear pattern. We might also be able to pursue fraud charges depending on what financial transactions we could document between Rebecca and my mother. Abigail recommended we try one more time to reach my mother directly before pursuing legal action. She suggested a letter that laid out all the evidence in a clear, factual way. Something my mother couldn't ignore or dismiss as easily as a phone call or visit. Diane volunteered to write the letter that night. She spent hours drafting and revising, making sure every point was clear and supported by documentation. The letter explained everything we'd discovered about Rebecca's history. It included contact information for Phyllis and Noah and the other victims who were willing to talk. It described the fake terminal illness and the fake pregnancy and the pattern of targeting vulnerable people. It outlined the financial fraud and the social media deception. Diane made copies of the most important evidence and included them with the letter. She sent everything certified mail the next morning so we'd have proof that my mother received it. Now we had to wait and see if my mother would finally open her eyes to what Rebecca really was. 3 days went by with nothing from my mother. Tom called on the third evening and told me he'd seen Louise at the grocery store that afternoon. She looked bad, really bad, thin like she'd lost weight fast and her face was pale and drawn. Tom said he tried to walk over to talk to her, but she saw him coming and practically ran out of the store, leaving her cart half full in the middle of the aisle. She didn't even look back when he called her name. That image stuck in my head all night. My mother running away from her own nephew in a grocery store. Rebecca had her so twisted up that she couldn't even face family members anymore. The next morning, Diane's phone rang while we were having coffee at her kitchen table. She answered, and her expression changed immediately. She mouthed "Holden" at me and put the phone on speaker. Holden Barrett had been my mother's financial advisor for 20 years. He managed her retirement accounts and helped her with tax planning and investment decisions. Diane knew him from some volunteer work they'd both done years ago. Holden sounded worried. He explained that he'd been trying to reach Louise for 2 weeks about some unusual activity in her accounts, but she wouldn't return his calls or emails. Large withdrawals that didn't match her normal spending patterns. Transfers to accounts he didn't recognize. All of it happening since she married Howard. He said he was concerned enough that he was reaching out to family members because something felt wrong. Diane asked if he could meet with us and explain everything in detail. Holden agreed immediately and said he could come to Diane's house that afternoon. He showed up at 2 o'clock carrying a briefcase full of papers. We sat at Diane's dining room table and he spread out account statements and transaction records. The numbers made me feel sick. Louise had withdrawn over $40,000 in the past 6 months. Small amounts at first, a few hundred here and there, then bigger chunks. 5,000, 8,000, 12,000. Holden pointed to a recent statement showing that Louise had opened a joint account with Rebecca 3 weeks ago. He wasn't consulted about it and didn't even know it existed until he saw the transfer records. Money was moving from Louise's retirement account into this new joint account, and then disappearing completely. Holden explained that he'd been Louise's advisor since she was in her 30s. He knew her spending habits and her financial goals. This behavior was completely out of character. She'd always been careful with money and consulted him before making any major financial decisions. Now she was draining accounts without telling him and refusing to respond when he tried to discuss his concerns. He asked us directly if we knew what was going on, because from a financial perspective, it looked like someone was systematically stealing from her. I showed Holden everything we'd collected about Rebecca. The hospital records, the statements from previous victims, the pattern of fraud across multiple families. He sat back in his chair and shook his head. He said he'd seen cases like this before where con artists targeted older people and drained their accounts. Usually it was romance scams or fake investment opportunities. He'd never seen it happen with a supposed family member, but the pattern was identical. Establish trust, create urgency, isolate the victim from advisors, extract money, disappear. Diane called Dylan and asked him to come over immediately. He arrived 30 minutes later and Holden walked him through all the financial records. Dylan said he could obtain official bank records through legal channels now that we had documented evidence of potential fraud. He made some calls right there at the table, and by the end of the day, he had subpoenas filed for all of Louise's account information and transaction histories. The bank records came back 2 days later. Dylan spread them across Diane's dining room table and we went through every page. The pattern was even worse than Holden had described. Money from Louise's account was transferred to 3 different accounts in Rebecca's name. One was the joint account Holden had found. The other 2 were individual accounts that Rebecca had opened using Louise's address. The transfers matched exactly what Rebecca had done to the previous families Dylan had tracked down. Small amounts at first to avoid suspicion, then larger and larger sums as she gained more control. In one case, Rebecca had convinced an elderly man to take out a second mortgage on his house and transfer the money to her. He'd lost everything. I felt this weird mix of being right and being horrified. We'd been right about Rebecca all along. She was stealing from my mother just like she'd stolen from other people. But seeing the actual numbers and knowing how much damage she'd already done made me want to throw up. $40,000 gone. My mother's retirement savings that she'd worked 30 years to build, just gone into Rebecca's accounts. Abigail came over that evening after Diane called her. She reviewed everything carefully, taking notes and asking questions about dates and amounts. She said we now had enough evidence to pursue legal action to protect Louise's assets. We could file for a restraining order to freeze the accounts and prevent more transfers. We could petition the court to reverse the will change based on undue influence. We might even be able to get criminal charges filed for fraud and theft. But Abigail said all of that would take time and court proceedings, and it would be a public battle that would humiliate my mother. Diane suggested we try one more approach first. Bring everything to Howard privately, and see if confronting him with hard evidence would break through whatever hold Rebecca had over him. If Howard would admit the truth and help us, then maybe we could stop Rebecca without dragging my mother through a public legal fight. It was a long shot, but we agreed to try. We found out where Howard worked from Tom. He was a manager at a supply company on the industrial side of town. Diane and I drove there on Tuesday during his lunch break. We waited in the parking lot until we saw him come out of the building. I got out of the car and called his name. Howard saw me and his face went pale. He turned around and started walking back toward the building. I ran after him and grabbed his arm. I told him we had evidence that Rebecca had stolen from multiple families and was stealing from Louise right now. Howard stopped walking. He stood there in the parking lot looking at the ground. Diane caught up to us and suggested we sit in Howard's car where we could talk privately. Howard didn't say anything, but he walked to his car and unlocked it. We all got in. Howard in the driver's seat, me in the passenger seat, Diane in the back. I pulled out the folder with everything we'd collected. The statements from previous victims, the bank records showing the transfers, the hospital documentation proving Rebecca had never been treated for any terminal illness, the timeline showing her pattern of behavior. Howard looked at each page and his hands started shaking. Diane explained who each person was and what Rebecca had done to them. The fake pregnancy, the fake cancer diagnosis, the stolen money, the destroyed relationships. Howard put his head in his hands and started crying. Not quiet tears, but deep sobs that shook his whole body. He said he'd known something was wrong for weeks, but he felt trapped. Rebecca had been threatening him. She told him that if he didn't support her story about being his daughter and about being terminally ill, she would tell Louise that he'd been abusive, that he'd hit her and threatened her and tried to control her. Howard was terrified of losing his marriage and being accused of something he never did. He didn't know how to fight back against someone who lied so easily. Then Howard told us something that made everything even worse. Rebecca had approached him before he even met Louise. She'd found him somehow and claimed to be his long-lost daughter from a brief relationship decades ago. She had details about his past that seemed real. She knew where he'd lived and worked. She knew names of people he'd dated. Howard wanted to believe her because he'd always regretted not having children. He took a paternity test to be sure. The results came back negative. Rebecca wasn't his biological daughter, but by then she'd already worked her way into his life. She was living in his apartment and had met his friends and knew everything about him. Howard confronted her about the paternity test. Rebecca didn't even pretend to be surprised or upset. She just smiled and said she'd never really thought he was her father. She'd needed a place to stay, and he seemed lonely. Then she told him she'd found Louise online and thought Louise would be a good target. She said if Howard didn't help her get close to Louise, she would destroy his reputation. She had recordings of private conversations. She had access to his bank accounts and email. She threatened to create evidence that he was dangerous and get him arrested. Howard said he tried to get away from her, but she followed him. When he started dating Louise, Rebecca inserted herself into the relationship. She convinced Louise that she was Howard's daughter and that she wanted to be part of their new family. By the time Howard realized what was happening, Louise was already attached to Rebecca. Howard watched helplessly as Rebecca isolated Louise from me and from other family members. He watched as Louise changed her will and started withdrawing money. He knew it was all wrong, but he was too scared to speak up because Rebecca had made it clear she would destroy him if he tried to expose her. I wanted to scream at Howard for letting this happen, for watching my mother get manipulated and doing nothing while Rebecca destroyed our family. But looking at him crying in his car with his hands shaking, I realized he was just another person Rebecca had trapped. Diane must have seen it on my face because she put her hand on my arm and spoke quietly to Howard about what needed to happen next. She told him the only way to fix this was to tell Louise the truth together. All of us, with every piece of evidence we'd collected. Howard wiped his face and nodded, but his voice came out rough when he finally spoke. He said we had to be careful because Rebecca was getting worse. The money was running low and she'd been acting strange, more angry, less careful about hiding who she really was. Howard thought she was planning something big before she disappeared. Maybe convincing Louise to sign over the house or take out a huge loan against it. He'd overheard Rebecca on the phone twice this week talking to someone about property values and equity loans. Diane pulled out her phone right there and started making calls. She reached out to Louise's neighbors, the Hendersons, who'd lived next door for 30 years. They'd watched me grow up. Mrs. Henderson answered and Diane explained everything quickly. How Louise was in trouble, how we needed to get her alone without Rebecca to show her the truth. Mrs. Henderson said they'd noticed the changes in Louise, how thin she looked, how she never came outside anymore unless Rebecca was with her. How Rebecca watched Louise like a guard dog. They agreed to help immediately. The plan was simple. Mrs. Henderson would call Louise and invite her over for coffee tomorrow morning. Just a quick visit between old friends. Rebecca usually left the house on Wednesday mornings for what she called doctor appointments, but Howard confirmed she actually went to the bank. We'd have maybe an hour. The next morning, I sat in the Hendersons' living room with Diane waiting. My stomach hurt, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Mr. Henderson kept watch at the window, and at 10:15 he said Louise was coming up the walk. Alone. Mrs. Henderson opened the door with a big smile and invited Louise in for coffee like she'd promised. My mother stepped inside talking about how she couldn't stay long. Then she saw me and Diane sitting on the couch. Her whole face changed. She turned back toward the door, but Mr. Henderson was standing there now, not blocking her exactly, but present. Mrs. Henderson touched Louise's arm gently and asked her to please just listen for 10 minutes. That's all we needed. 10 minutes. Louise looked trapped and scared, but she sat down in the chair across from us. I started talking before she could leave. I told her I loved her, that I was scared for her, that I wasn't angry even though I had every right to be. My voice cracked, but I kept going. Diane opened the folder we'd brought and started laying out papers on the coffee table between us. She explained each piece methodically like she was presenting a case in court. Rebecca's history with other families. The fake terminal illness with hospital records proving she'd never been treated. The bank statements showing $40,000 transferred out of Louise's accounts. Howard's confession about the paternity test proving Rebecca wasn't his daughter. About how Rebecca had threatened and manipulated him too. Louise's face went through. So many changes I could barely track them. Shock first. Then denial as she shook her head and said we were wrong. Then anger as she insisted Rebecca was sick, and we were attacking a dying woman. But Diane kept presenting evidence. Statement after statement from Rebecca's previous victims. Timeline after timeline showing the exact same pattern. Finally, something shifted in my mother's expression. A terrible understanding spreading across her face like she was waking up from a nightmare. She kept repeating the same thing over and over. But she's dying. But she's dying. Until Diane put the hospital records directly in her hands. The official documentation showing Rebecca had never been treated for any terminal condition. No cancer, no heart disease, no rare blood disorder, nothing. My mother started crying then. Not quiet tears, but deep sobs that shook her whole body. She couldn't seem to stop. Words came out between the sobs about how she'd felt something was wrong for weeks, but couldn't let herself see it, because seeing it would mean facing what she'd done to me. How badly she'd treated her own daughter. How foolish she'd been to believe a stranger over her own family. Mrs. Henderson brought tissues and sat next to Louise, rubbing her back. My mother looked at me with red, swollen eyes, and I saw real horror there. Horror at herself, at what she'd done, at what she'd almost lost. Louise's phone started ringing in her purse. She ignored it. It rang again, and again. Then it started buzzing with text after text. Howard pulled out his phone and showed us the messages Rebecca was sending. They were nothing like the sweet dying daughter act we'd all seen. These messages were mean and demanding, asking where Louise was, why she wasn't answering, saying she better not be with that ungrateful daughter, threatening to have another health crisis if Louise didn't come home right now. The messages got worse with each one, more aggressive, more controlling, showing a side of Rebecca that Louise had never seen before. My mother stared at the phone in shock as another text came through calling her stupid and saying she was wasting Rebecca's time. Louise's hands started shaking as she read each new message. This wasn't a sick woman worried about her mother figure. This was someone angry about losing control. The phone rang again, and this time Louise answered it. Her voice came out steady and calm when she said she was with friends and would be home later. Rebecca's response came through, so loud we could all hear it even without speakerphone. The voice was nothing like the sweet, weak tone Rebecca usually used. It was hard and mean and full of rage. She called Louise stupid and ungrateful. Said she deserved to die alone. That she'd wasted Rebecca's time and effort. The sweet dying daughter act was completely gone. Louise's face went white as Rebecca screamed through the phone. Then Louise did something that surprised all of us. She hit the speaker button and set the phone on the coffee table so everyone could hear. Rebecca's real voice filled the Hendersons' living room as she completely dropped her mask. She screamed about how easy it was to manipulate Louise. How pathetic she was to believe someone she barely knew over her own daughter. How she should have gotten more money before Louise's family started interfering with her plans. Rebecca's words got more hateful with every sentence. She bragged about faking the terminal illness. About how she'd done this before to other stupid lonely women who were desperate for love. About how she'd almost gotten the house signed over before we ruined everything. She said Louise was worthless and weak and deserved everything bad that happened to her. My mother sat frozen listening to every word. Listening to the person she'd chosen over me reveal exactly who she really was. Listening to the proof that everything we'd told her was true. Rebecca kept screaming and threatening and revealing more details about her plans. How she'd targeted Howard first. How she'd researched Louise online and knew exactly what buttons to push. How she'd planned to disappear with everything once she'd drained the accounts and refinanced the house. She was so angry she couldn't stop talking. Couldn't stop admitting to everything she'd done. Howard grabbed his phone from his pocket and started recording without saying anything. He held it up so the microphone could catch every word coming through the speaker. Rebecca kept screaming about the fake diagnosis and how she'd researched Louise's finances online before Howard even introduced them. She talked about the other families she'd scammed and how much money she'd gotten from each one. She said Louise was the easiest target yet because she was so desperate to be loved after her divorce. She bragged about copying Louise's bank account information and how simple it was to transfer money once she had access. Howard's hand shook while he recorded, but he kept the phone steady and let Rebecca confess to everything. She was so angry she couldn't stop herself from admitting every detail of her plan. The recording went on for almost 10 minutes before Rebecca finally hung up after calling Louise one last name. My mother sat frozen on the couch staring at nothing. Her face looked empty, like something inside her had broken completely. She turned to me slowly, and her eyes were filled with tears, but they looked different from before. Clear instead of confused. She reached for my hand and I let her take it even though part of me wanted to pull away. She told me she was sorry and kept saying it over and over. She said she understood if I could never forgive her, but she needed me to know that Rebecca had manipulated her, and she was so sorry for choosing someone else over her own daughter. She cried while she talked and the words came out broken and painful. She said she'd been so lonely after the divorce that she'd believed everything Rebecca told her because she wanted, so badly, to feel needed. She apologized for the will and the party and every terrible thing she'd said to me. Diane put her arm around Louise and let her cry. I pulled out my phone and called the police while Diane called Abigail. The operator answered and I explained that we had a recorded confession of fraud and elder abuse. I played part of the recording over the phone and the operator's voice changed immediately. She said she was dispatching officers right away and asked for Louise's address. Diane finished talking to Abigail, who said she was getting in her car and would meet us at the police station. The operator told me to save the recording and not delete anything. She said officers would be at Louise's house within minutes to prevent Rebecca from leaving or destroying evidence. Howard gave them his house key and explained that Rebecca was probably still there alone. The operator confirmed that 2 units were on their way and warned us not to go to the house ourselves. We waited at the neighbor's house for updates. Louise couldn't stop shaking and kept apologizing to everyone. The neighbors brought her water and tissues while we all sat in their living room staring at our phones. 30 minutes later, Howard got a call from one of the officers. They'd arrived at the house and found Rebecca in the bedroom packing suitcases. She had jewelry spread across the bed, including pieces from my grandmother's collection. Cash was stuffed in her purse along with Louise's checkbook and credit cards. The officer said Rebecca tried to claim she lived there and was just organizing her things, but they'd found Louise's financial documents in Rebecca's bag, along with notebooks full of account numbers and passwords. They arrested her on the spot for theft and fraud. The officer asked Howard to come down to the station to give a statement and secure the house. The district attorney called Diane 3 days later. She'd reviewed the case and was very interested in prosecuting because Rebecca's pattern of fraud across multiple states made this a federal matter. The recorded confession combined with the physical evidence and Rebecca's history with other families gave them a strong case. The district attorney said they were contacting Rebecca's previous victims to see if any would testify. 2 families had already agreed and were willing to share their experiences in court. She explained that cases like this were difficult to prove without solid evidence, but we had everything we needed. Rebecca was being held on high bail because she was considered a flight risk. The district attorney said the trial would probably happen in 6 months, but Rebecca would remain in jail until then. Louise couldn't stay in the house where Rebecca had manipulated her for almost a year. She packed a bag and moved into Diane's guest room temporarily. Howard stayed at the house alone dealing with police visits and evidence collection. He started seeing a therapist twice a week to process his own guilt about letting Rebecca hurt Louise and enabling her behavior. Louise wouldn't talk to him at first, but after 2 weeks she agreed to have coffee with him at a neutral location. They sat in a diner for 3 hours talking about how Rebecca had played them both. Howard explained about the fake paternity test and the threats Rebecca had made. Louise listened and cried and said she understood he'd been trapped too. They agreed to try marriage counseling, but Louise wasn't ready to move back home yet. Abigail scheduled meetings with Louise to reverse the will change. The lawyer who'd witnessed the coerced document provided a statement explaining that Louise had seemed anxious and rushed during the signing. He said Rebecca had waited in the car outside his office the entire time, and Louise had kept checking her phone nervously. Abigail filed paperwork to restore the original will that left everything to me with provisions for any future grandchildren I might have. She explained the process would take a few weeks, but the circumstances of the change made reversal straightforward. Louise signed all the documents and told Abigail she wanted to make sure I was protected no matter what happened to our relationship. I visited my mother at Diane's house the following week. We sat in the backyard and talked for 2 hours about everything that had happened. Louise tried to explain how Rebecca had isolated her from everyone who cared about her. She said Rebecca would cry whenever Louise tried to spend time with me or other family members. She'd claim health crises that required Louise's immediate attention. She'd planted doubts about my motives and suggested I only cared about the inheritance. Louise said she knew now how stupid she'd been, but at the time Rebecca's manipulation felt so real. I told her I was angry and hurt, and it would take a long time before I could trust her again. She nodded and said she understood. We agreed to keep meeting weekly to work through everything that had broken between us. Lauren Lockwood started working with Louise 2 weeks after Rebecca's arrest. Lauren specialized in family manipulation cases and had seen dozens of situations like ours. She explained to Louise during their first session that Rebecca was likely a skilled con artist who specifically targeted people going through major life changes. New marriages created vulnerability because people wanted their blended families to work. Lauren said Rebecca had probably studied Louise's social media and public records before Howard introduced them. She'd learned about the divorce and my mother's loneliness and had crafted her approach perfectly. Lauren helped Louise understand that being manipulated didn't make her stupid or weak. It made her human and trusting, which Rebecca had exploited deliberately. Louise asked me during one of our visits if I'd be willing to do joint therapy sessions with her eventually. I thought about it for a few days before telling her yes, but I needed her to understand something first. I said rebuilding trust would take months or maybe years, and our relationship might never be exactly what it was before she chose Rebecca over me. I told her I'd been erased from her life like I didn't matter, and that kind of hurt didn't heal quickly. She cried and said she knew, and she'd spend however long it took proving she was sorry. I agreed to try joint sessions once she'd done more individual work with Lauren. I needed to see real change before I could sit in a room with her and a therapist and work through our damage together. The district attorney filed charges 3 days after Rebecca's arrest. Fraud in the first degree, theft by deception, financial exploitation of an elderly person. The list went on for 2 full pages. Each count carried its own potential sentence, and the prosecutor told us Rebecca was looking at serious prison time if convicted. The bail hearing happened fast. Rebecca stood in front of the judge wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of her usual carefully chosen outfits. She tried to cry, but the judge wasn't interested. He set bail at $200,000. Rebecca's public defender argued it was too high, but the judge pointed out her history of fleeing from previous victims. She'd vanished from 3 different states when people started asking questions. The bail stood. Rebecca went back to county jail to wait for trial. Louise and Howard started seeing a therapist named Dr. Anderson, who worked specifically with couples dealing with manipulation and abuse. Howard drove to the first appointment alone because Louise wasn't ready to be in the same room with him yet. He went every week for a month before Louise agreed to join him. Dr. Anderson helped them understand how Rebecca had targeted the weak spots in their new marriage. She'd played on Howard's guilt about not having a relationship with his supposed daughter. She'd exploited Louise's loneliness after the divorce and her desire to be needed. The sessions were painful, according to what Diane told me. Louise and Howard both had to face how easily they'd let Rebecca drive a wedge between them and everyone who actually cared about them. After 6 weeks, Howard asked if he could move back home. Louise said yes, but they kept separate bedrooms and kept going to therapy twice a week. The bank's fraud investigation recovered about $30,000 from accounts Rebecca had opened in her name. Another $10,000 was gone completely. She'd spent it on clothes and trips and expensive dinners, money that should have been Louise's retirement savings. The bank manager called Louise to explain what they'd recovered and what was lost forever. Louise came to Diane's house the next day and told me she wanted to split the recovered money with me. Half for me and half for her. I said no immediately. That was her money and she needed it after everything Rebecca had stolen. Louise insisted. She said it was the least she could do after cutting me out of her will and her life. Diane pulled me aside later and told me to take it. Not because I needed the money, but because Louise needed to do something concrete to start making things right. I accepted $15,000 the following week. Diane hosted a small gathering at her house 2 weeks later. Just close family. Louise brought a wooden box I recognized from my grandmother's dresser. She set it on Diane's dining room table and opened the lid. My grandmother's jewelry sat inside wrapped in tissue paper, the pearl necklace my grandfather gave her on their wedding day, the gold bracelet with tiny charms representing each of her children, the diamond earrings she wore to every important family event, the sapphire ring that had belonged to her mother. Louise took out each piece slowly. She told me the story behind every item as she handed them over. Her voice broke when she got to the charm bracelet. She said she'd almost let Rebecca sell these pieces. Almost let her destroy the physical memories of the woman who raised her. She cried while Tom and Diane and the others watched. I put the jewelry back in the box and hugged my mother for the first time in months. It didn't fix everything, but it was something. Rebecca's trial date got scheduled for 4 months out. Her lawyer contacted the prosecutor 2 months in and proposed a plea deal. Rebecca would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommended sentence. The prosecutor called me and Louise to discuss it. He said we could push for trial, but there was always risk with a jury. Rebecca might get a sympathetic juror who believed her victim act. The plea deal guaranteed consequences. 5 years in state prison plus restitution orders to Louise and the other families she'd scammed. We both agreed to accept it. Rebecca stood in court 6 weeks later and admitted to everything. The judge accepted the plea and imposed the 5-year sentence. It wasn't enough. 5 years couldn't undo the damage she'd caused to my relationship with my mother. But watching her get led away in handcuffs while she finally stopped pretending to be innocent provided something close to closure. Louise waited until Rebecca was officially sentenced before planning anything. Then she called everyone who'd been invited to the original party and asked them to come to her house for a small dinner. Just family. No big celebration. She said she wanted to properly mark her 60th birthday with the people who actually loved her. 20 people showed up, including me. The atmosphere felt heavy at first. Everyone knew what had happened and nobody was sure how to act. Louise stood up before we ate and gave a short speech. She apologized to everyone for how she'd behaved. She said she'd let herself be manipulated because she was lonely and wanted to believe someone needed her. She said that was no excuse for choosing a stranger over her family. She looked directly at me when she said she was sorry for erasing me from her life, and she'd spend however long it took earning back my trust. People clapped quietly when she finished. We ate dinner and talked carefully around the elephant in the room. It wasn't the party anyone had planned, but it felt real in a way the original celebration never would have. My mother and I met for coffee the following Tuesday at a place halfway between our houses. We sat outside even though it was cold because being in public made the conversation easier. I told her I needed boundaries if we were going to rebuild anything. We'd see each other once a week. Just the two of us. No Howard until I was ready. No big family gatherings where I'd have to perform being okay. No pressure to forgive her faster than I was capable of forgiving. Louise agreed to everything. She said she understood our relationship might never be what it was before. I told her that was true and I needed her to accept it. We met every week after that. Sometimes for coffee, sometimes for lunch, sometimes just for a walk around the park near her house. We talked about small things mostly. Her garden, my job, the weather. We were learning how to be around each other again without the weight of everything that had broken between us. 3 months passed since that night I stood on my mother's doorstep and got told not to come to her party. My relationship with Louise felt different now. More careful, more honest, less automatic. I'd learned that being someone's daughter didn't guarantee they'd choose you when it mattered. I'd learned that family was about who showed up during the worst moments, not who shared your blood. Diane called me almost every day. She'd become more like a mother than an aunt. Tom and I grabbed dinner once a week. Lisa and I went to movies. Cousins I barely knew before Rebecca had brought us together in ways I never expected. My mother was working on becoming someone I could trust again. Whether she'd get there was still uncertain, but I was in a better place than I thought possible when this all started. I had people around me who'd proven they'd fight for me. That counted for something. Maybe everything.